Good morning. This is Dr. David A. Padgett. This is World Regional Geography 1010, Section 98B, spring semester 2021. Today is March 10th. So today I'm going to share my screen, and then we will get into the activities for today. First things first, I would like to reiterate, get in the student view here. I'd like to reiterate that you all are in the process of completing the research quiz for this week. And so you go here, here. And so the research quiz, again, is somewhat similar in terms of the delivery format to the Unit A exam. And so you'll download the quiz. It's a PDF document here. And notice it's a multiple choice quiz. Also, just like you had with the Unit A exam, you have an answer sheet. Now, if you remember, now this answer sheet is different, slightly different from the answer sheet that you had with the Unit A exam. So if you notice, the instructions on the quiz require you to not only answer the question, but also provide an explanation or justification for how you arrived at your answer and a reference source. And so you provide the letter for your answer here, then the justification for your answer there, and then the reference source here. So I went over all of this in Monday's lecture, so you should refer back to that um, recording. And again, if you have any questions about how to go about completing this quiz, let me know. Oh, one more very important thing. Notice your references must only be from either the textbook or any of the sources I've posted in this course at Unit B, or the lecture recordings, or the History of Geography timeline. That's it. Okay, no Googling, no, I looked this up, I couldn't find it. Do not Google information and then tell me that you use that to arrive at your answer. Because if you do that, you'll get this. Okay. We're using verifiable, reliable sources here only. If you search and search and search through the materials for help answering a question and you get confused or you just can't find it, you get frustrated, call me, email me, let me know. I'm here to answer your questions. Don't search and then get frustrated and say, oh, I'm just going to Google it, right? Just follow the rules and you'll be okay. All right. So let's get back into the topic for today. And today, of course, we are looking at the human geography of North America. And so just to review, we spent time looking at the demographics of North America or the United States. We also spent a lot of time, or where we left off was we were looking at internal migrations. And the main migration that we were focusing upon were migrations of African American people. And so we were specifically discussing the Great Migration. Okay, in the textbook on page 550, we see the discussion on internal migration in the United States. And as you can see, we spent a lot of time last time talking about the Great Migration, that is the migration of African American people from the South to the North during the 20th century. And you can see these arrow symbols represent Black people moving from the South to the North. We discussed the push factors, of course, being racism, Jim Crow, lack of economic opportunity, lack of political opportunity. And there were a variety of reasons that pushed African American migrants out of the South during the Great Migration. So we then started to discuss, what drew African Americans to the North. And one of the things that we discussed during that portion of the lecture were these economic sectors. And so that takes us to the portion of the textbook that focuses upon the major sectors of any economy. So if we go to page 56, we have the 4 economic sectors. And so how that again relates to the Great Migration is that African Americans, 90% of whom were in the South at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, were largely employed in the primary sector, specifically agriculture. It was not lucrative. It was not a way to wealth for the mass majority of African Americans. So they were pulled to the North by the secondary sector, which were manufacturing jobs, and also to some degree to tertiary sector jobs in the North. The first part of the 20th century was the burgeoning Industrial Revolution that brought a lot of manufacturing to the northern states and large cities such as Chicago and Cleveland and Baltimore and Chicago and Philadelphia. The second half of the 20th century, well, actually, is the period following the Second World War, brought forth the second industrial revolution of sorts that was buoyed by the fact that the United States was very much unscathed after the Second World War. The rest of the world was in shambles from bombs and nuclear bombs and the like, while the United States stood as the lone standing manufacturing power left for a period. And there was a period of great prosperity. And so opportunities opened up for African Americans, even African Americans who did not have a great amount of education. Opportunities opened up for them to attain middle class status through work in factories and auto plants and the like. And so we then made note of the fact that there was a change that occurred, or a shift in the internal migration patterns for African Americans. And so we see here in this article a story about the reversal of the Great Migration. And so this is from the year 2015, still relatively recent. And the title of the article says, after nearly 100 years, Great Migration begins reversal. So the question is, okay, well, what happened? What is happening? So for decades, basically a century or so, Black people were leaving the South. And we have all the reasons why they were leaving the South. But then starting in the 1990s, demographers started to notice that there were more African Americans moving to the South from the North than the other way around. And this was the first time that that phenomenon was occurring since emancipation. So the questions were, well, why was that happening? You know, the South was bad, really, really, really bad for Black people. Well, let's look at pull factors and push factors. Let's look at some push factors first of all. So remember, a push factor is something that causes a person to leave a place. And I do believe that when we left off on Monday, we were looking at this article focusing upon decline of in manufacturing in the United States. And so if you remember, it was the manufacturing sector that really attracted African Americans to places like such as Philadelphia. And on Monday, I shared with you this article that showed how in the as the rest of the world recovered from the Second World War, places like China and India and Japan and Korea and other places in the world started to uh, build their manufacturing strength. And what they could offer to US companies was cheap labor. And so a lot of companies in this country that made washing machines and cars and other finished goods uh, moved their works to China and Japan and other parts of the world to take advantage of cheap labor costs, which meant that they could keep the prices of goods down, which meant that we could still afford those goods. Because as you all know, labor is the most expensive part of running a business. Humans cost more than anything else, human labor. And so if you can lower the cost of labor as these companies did by moving overseas, then obviously that boosts profits for them and access to products for us. The problem with that is that notice here, the manufacturing sector lost millions of jobs during the period as we entered the 1970s up through the year 2000 into the beginning of the 21st century. And again, these jobs aren't just jobs. They represent families. These are people who were supporting families with these jobs. And so as a result of people not being able to work or losing their jobs, losing their livelihood, losing their savings, a lot of people also lost their homes, lost their families. Crime began to rise. And so we looked at this article here, and this article basically encapsulates the decline of quality of life in the Rust Belt, which used to be the manufacturing belt. High crime, high murder rates, less opportunity for home ownership, less opportunity for affordable housing. I mean, being able to afford a comfortable place to live is a critical part of quality of life in any city. Think about it. If you don't have a comfortable place to live, there's not much else you can do successfully. If you don't have a comfortable place to lay your head at night, there's not much else you can do successfully. It's critical. So if when people start to lose their homes, if they can't afford a home, if they can't afford to pay their rent, that's a seriously negative impact upon their quality of life. And that's what started to happen in the Rust Belt region. Now, at the same time, while quality of life was declining, we in the North, we started to see somewhat of a shift in opportunities, specifically opportunities in the manufacturing sector in the South. So the South had largely or historically been a region supported by agriculture. But as we started to come into the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century, we started to see new manufacturing regions start to grow in Tennessee, in the Carolinas. There are car plants in Mississippi. There are high-tech manufacturing sectors in Texas and California and up in the Pacific Northwest. So we started to see a shift away from that, where that pink color area symbol is, which is the historic location of the manufacturing belt, and more opportunities shift towards the South. Now, in conjunction with this shift in manufacturing to the South came some political changes, obviously, with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, which began to be institutionalized in the forms of policy. For instance, in Atlanta, when Maynard Jackson became his first Black mayor, he put forth a policy that said that any city contract or any work funded by the city of Atlanta had to have at least a 25% minority contract representation, right? That opened up many opportunities for Black business people, right? That is not possible in most cases without an African-American mayor. There are cities in the South where 10 years have passed and there were maybe 1% of city contracts going to Black contractors. Everything else went to white male or owned businesses. And so, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, Willie Harrington in Memphis, really paved the way for, or they really represent Black political power in the South that did not exist before that. And so now you have a fully inclusive workforce in the South that started to come about in the 1970s and 80s, which manifested itself in greater opportunities for African Americans. And so cities like Atlanta, they were able to attract the Olympic Games in 1996, and thousands of people began to migrate and move from the crime-infested cities like the Detroit and New York. And even though opportunities were less and jobs were less in these northern manufacturing belt cities, the cost of living remained high. It wasn't as if, you all can't find work. Okay, we're going to lower the cost of rent and food and energy. No, but all of those amenities were cheaper in the South, and so we started to see more and more African Americans move to the South after decades and decades of movement toward the North, driven largely by change in quality of life. And you can see by in this graphic, these point symbols, and where you have people who were flowing into Atlanta and from 2005 to 2010, and people flowing into Nashville, people flowing into Dallas and Houston, whereas notice places like Chicago and Detroit were just steadily losing population, and those people were moving towards the South, according to this graphic. So internal migration is again, a pretty fascinating topic and that we are looking at in terms of African Americans. And so that was the Great Migration. You also make note of the fact that there is or was a westward migration of Black people. So here we have arrows showing, of course, the Great Migration, Black people moving to the north. But there was a westward movement of African Americans that was very significant. In fact, a portion of that migration was called the Exodusters migration. And so Exodus is a biblical term, of course. And so not all Black people went north. Some Black people went west. And they established towns and cities, for one thing. There's the organization called the Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance. And so the people who belong to this organization represent towns and settlements founded by Black people across the United States. Many places such as mentioned in this article, Nicodemus, Kansas. So Nicodemus, Kansas was one of these places or settlements that was founded by Black people who went to the West. And there's a very rich history of Black people in the West. Some of these people you might have heard of: Bill Pickett, who was essentially a cowboy. He wasn't a Black cowboy. He was a cowboy. A lot of cowboys were Black. And even, I guess, up until COVID, but there's there's a Black rodeo that travels throughout the country. And so this is a rich, long tradition of African Americans engaged in rodeo. In some cases, Bill Pickett is credited to some degree with creating the bulldogging competition. Now, a lot of you all are young, but there was a old TV show called The Lone Ranger. And so the Lone Ranger, I used to watch The Lone Ranger when I was coming up. This is from 2013, but these older images, like this one and this one, that's the Lone Ranger, old TV show. This one, looks like they remade it. But this one, the Lone Ranger. But obviously, the Lone Ranger here is depicted as a Caucasian gentleman, but the original person, the person that the Lone Ranger TV show was based upon, was Bass Reeves, who was an African American cowboy. Very famous African American cowboy. And someone had the idea, well, let's make a TV show about this Lone Ranger. But remember, this was in the 50s and 60s. There was no way you could have a television show about a Black man riding around being a cowboy on TV in the 1950s and 60s. There was no way. That just was not going to happen. So it was a great story, though. So they made him white. I guess that's what we call today cultural appropriation, right? And so there's this rich history of African Americans going to the West and founding cities and doing rodeo and establishing towns, and all of that, that we should not forget about, and then we should probably study further. Now, I'm going to move next. We've spent a lot of time, obviously, talking about African American migrations. Tennessee State University is a Black college, so, but we should also not be remiss. We would be remiss if we did not discuss the internal migration of Latinx populations. And so this article is somewhat, in my opinion, misnamed. It says Hispanic immigration boom rattles South. I would say it would be more aptly titled Hispanic internal migration boom rattles the South. So what is this article talking about? So if you remember from our early discussion, we made note of the fact that the majority of the Latinx population in this country is situated along the U.S.-Mexico border. And it was pretty much that way for most of the time, up until very recently. This article is from the year 2000, which really was I don't want to say was the high point, because this trend is continuing, this trend of Latinx population moving from the border region into places like North Carolina and Tennessee. And so this article mentions that, in fact, in Tennessee, the Latinx population grew nearly 90% between 1990 and 1998. And so in Nashville, I can speak to this. In Nashville in 1990, Nashville was 1% Latinx. By the year 2000, by the 2000 census, the Latinx population was 7%. By 2010, 1 in 10 people, or 10% of Nashville residents, were Latinx. And I don't know what the numbers are for the 2020 census. I guess they'll be coming out. But the impact, the societal impact upon the South has been great, because the South, for a century or so, or really pretty much ever since the country was established, was mostly Black and white. We didn't have this third population with the different language being spoken in large numbers until very recently. And so in terms of providing education, we weren't prepared. In terms of employment, we weren't prepared. I mean, the South just was not prepared, and still, to the most part, is not prepared for this influx. And as you can see, in some cases, and as is described in this article, so let's look at this article. So this article is based on a small town called Siler City, North Carolina, that has about 5,500 residents, but their elementary school is 40% Hispanic. Well, why is that? Well, why are all these Latinx people going to North Carolina? Well, the main reason is for employment in the meat industry, or meat packing industry. So Siler City has 2 poultry processing plants. So why are these Latinx people taking these jobs in the poultry processing plants? These are very dangerous jobs. In fact, working in the meat industry is one of the most dangerous jobs you can have in terms of employee safety in the United States. So why would these Latinx people take these jobs? Well, guess what? White people and black people in the South no longer find those jobs attractive, but we still like to eat beef. We still like to eat chicken. So somebody had to do those jobs. And so thus we had this influx of Latinx population. And there's a long, sordid history between the meat industry and these Latinx populations in the United States. This is just one small example in Siler City, North Carolina. But that was the pull factor was secondary sector employment in these meat processing plants for these Latinx populations. And in the case of Siler City, North Carolina, and this shouldn't be shocking to any of us, as you can see, the Ku Klux Klan was very much in opposition to the arrival of these Latinx populations. Very much opposed. And you see the quote there, to get a few chickens plucked, is it worth losing your heritage? Very interesting. You know, all these people still probably eating chicken, but they don't want the people to process the chicken to be Latinx. But then they don't want to do it, right? So this type of xenophobia, and remember xenophobia, as we learned early in the course, is fear of foreigners. This kind of xenophobia was not lost on Tennessee. You know, of course, in North Carolina, the Klan rolled out. But in Tennessee, we had, well, in Nashville, there was a few years ago, there was an English-only referendum. And so here's a story about the English-only referendum in Nashville. And so, yeah, so there was actually a movement on the part of some representatives in local government here in Nashville to have everything, all communications, all public documents in only English. And the argument was that it would make things more efficient. But we know, everybody knows that this was really a political move. It was a move to further oppress and suppress the growing Latinx population in the city that I said, once again, went from 1% in 1990 to 10% in 2010, which essentially scared the Dickens out of a lot of the majority population. What are we going to do with all these Latinx people? They keep coming, they keep coming. And we were wholly unprepared. Around this time, I remember there was only one police officer on Nashville's police force that spoke Spanish. One, uno. One. This poor guy was on call 24 hours a day because if a Latinx person who only spoke Spanish dialed 911, they had to talk to this one police officer, right? I hope things have improved, but that's where we were not too long ago, even with the population of Latinx people that was growing by leaps and bounds. Also, I've volunteered in schools around Nashville, and the schools really were not, maybe are not prepared for people who don't speak English. And you might ask, well, how can these parents send their children to school and they don't speak English? Well, some of the parents might have immigrated and might have been in a different part of the United States. Maybe the children know very little English, but public education in this country is compulsory. If you are a parent and you have to have a really good reason for not sending your children to school. Unless you're homeschooling them or there's some other really compelling reason, your children have to be in school. And in some places, if children are truant, they put the parents in jail. That's how serious that laws are about compulsory education. And so in the schools, they can't turn children away because this is compulsory. So if children show up at the door of the school or in the middle of November and they need to go to school, the school can't say no, right? And so I've been in classrooms where there's 6, 7, 8 children in there who don't speak a word of English, just got to Nashville, or their parents did, and here they are. And the only thing the teacher can do is hope that there's another student who can translate, because we don't have sufficient numbers of people who are trained to translate from Spanish to English and vice versa. And I'm pretty sure it's still that way right now, unless something really there's been a drastic change that I don't know about. So by and large, the South has not been ready for this influx of Latinx people, and it's a new thing. It's a new presence, and so we're all trying to work together to form a community with ourselves and our Latinx brothers and sisters. Okay, let's look at another migration, internal migration, and that takes us to this map, figure 12.20b. So at figure 12.20b, if you'll notice, this is a map of the migration of music, which represents a phenomenon known as cultural diffusion. So I'm going to type that into the chat. That is cultural diffusion. So cultural diffusion is simply the fact that when people migrate, they bring their culture with them. And so music is a part of culture, in this case, a part of African culture. And so here we have this arrow representing tribal music from Africa as Africans are brought to the Americas. And it starts here in the New Orleans, Louisiana area. And so if you ever go to New Orleans, get off of Bourbon Street, there's a place called Congo Square. And so Congo Square, if you read the history, is essentially the birthplace of jazz and essentially the birthplace of Black music. And it's graphically described or displayed on this map. So here you have, Congo Square and the beginnings of jazz and the blues and so on and so forth. But in the midst of all of that blue color area symbol, you'll notice there's a yellow color area symbol that represents Cajun music. And so, of course, looking at Louisiana, you say Cajun. Well, yeah, of course, when I think about Louisiana, I think about Cajun people. Of course, that's normal, correct? However, notice that same color area symbol is in Quebec, Canada, in the Quebec province of Canada, which is the French-speaking portion of Canada. And you might scratch your head and say, well, wait a minute. I never heard of Cajun music or Cajun food being related or associated with Canada in any way. But it came as a result of internal migration. So if we go back to our materials, there's discussion of the Acadian migration out of Canada. And so the Francophone and Anglo populations of Canada have always historically been rivals. And in some cases, the rivalry has come to such a head that the Francophone population threatens to secede from Canada. They want to leave and form their own French-speaking country, right? And then, of course, it dies down. But that conflict between the Francophone and Anglo Canadians has been in place for a long time. It really came to a head during the Acadian expulsion of 1755. And so what happened was the Anglos kicked French-speaking Canadians out of Canada. So where did they go? Well, if you remember, during that period of time, this part of what we now know of as the United States was held by the French. It was part of what eventually became the Louisiana Purchase territory. And so a lot of the French-speaking Canadians moved to the New Orleans and Louisiana region. And so you might be asking, well, where do we get Cajun from? Well, Cajun is a mispronunciation, if you will, of Acadian. So maybe at first, if you ask these people, well, what are you? They say, well, I'm Acadian. Over time, Acadian became Cajun. And it's just like preparing to go to the store becomes fixing to go to the store, eventually becomes finna, right? It's just progression or progressive degeneration of language. So Cajun is a mispronunciation of Acadian by Acadians. And so what happened, of course, was over a period of time, these over a period of time, these French people intermingled with African people, intermingled with other cultures, intermingled with Native American cultures, and out of that came this Cajun culture with music and food and basically kind of its own language. And of course, when we look at the rest of the map, notice that the blue color area symbol represents the expansion of the blues, or what they call the rural blues, across the South, which eventually became jazz, otherwise known as the urban blues. And then we had out of that R&B, and of course, eventually hip hop and everything that we see coming from all of that. Of course, the one of the high points of the development of the urban blues, so to speak, was with the founding of the Motown label in Detroit, which gave rise to famous groups such as the Temptations and Diana Ross and Supremes and Aretha Franklin and Smokey Robinson and the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson and on and on and on and on. And so we could see this progressive growth of different genres of music coming out of African roots as Black people migrated out of the South throughout the country. Now, you'll probably notice that there's a green color area symbol there that represents bluegrass music. And you'd probably think, well, what does bluegrass music have to do with Black people? Well, if you think about it, the seminal instrument for bluegrass music is the banjo. Listen to that word, banjo. That's an African word. A banjo is an African instrument. As a matter of fact, unbeknownst to many people, all string instruments originated in Africa, including the piano. Usually people think of a violin or a cello, think of someplace in Europe. No, those string instruments originated in Africa, including the banjo, which again is the seminal instrument for bluegrass music. And so even bluegrass music has its roots in African music. So this map again is a I guess, a display or visual display or a visual representation of the concept of cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion. And that is when people migrate and take their culture with them as they migrate. You can see that illustrated in many ways on this particular map. So looking further, you might ask yourself, maybe even still, well, so what, Dr. Padgett? Why are we studying any of this in terms of these population and demographics? Why is this even remotely important? Well, I spoke in terms of some of the inequities that were present in the South and the North in this country, but one of the main issues that we look at in terms of demographics is the relationship between demographics and wealth. And so with this chart really illustrates the what we call the racial wealth inequality gap in the United States. And so if you notice, if you start on this graph in 1983, the average African-American household had about 1/20th of the wealth of the average white household. And then if we move to the year 2007, 2008, that's the year of the economic crash that occurred in this country, or the Great Recession, as it was called. Notice everybody took a hit. White people lost wealth. And let me speak more specifically when I say wealth. Let's not get confused about the difference between wealth and income. Income is the amount of money that you earn by working in a given year. Wealth represents your assets. What do you own? How much money do you have in the bank? How many liquid assets? How much liquid assets do you have in the bank? Do you have any real estate, any property? Do you own a business, so on and so forth? That is wealth. Now, what's really interesting is, unbeknownst to others, or maybe you, the primary pathway to becoming wealthy in this country is inheritance. Now, we do have cases of rags to riches stories. I mean, we do still in this country, this country still does offer a lot of opportunity to people who might not have a lot of wealth at first to become wealthy. So we all know about the musical artist Jay-Z, right? This guy grew up poor in public housing in New York. And now, through his talents, he has become one of the 5 recognized Black billionaires in the United States. And you can probably name them. Okay, there's Oprah, who graduated from Tennessee State University, by the way. There's Jay-Z. There's Robert Johnson, Robert Smith, Michael Jordan. Oh, well, there's 6. Now, Tyler Perry has recently been recognized as a billionaire. So there's 6 Black billionaires in the United States, and you know all 6 of them. Now, again, Jay-Z came from very, very low income background and was able to rise to the highest level of wealth, at least among Black people in this country. But that's not the way that most wealthy people become wealthy in this country. Most wealthy people become wealthy in this country because somebody died and left the money, right? So if you look at this chart, if Black people die on average, what are you going to get? Maybe enough of an insurance policy to pay for the funeral? Are you getting any property? Probably not. Are you getting any money? Maybe, most likely not. And this is an historic inequity that's been passed down through the generations. Now, and there's a whole other conversation that we can have about that I explore largely in my urban geography class, Geography 4850, where I really take a deep dive into the relationship between real estate and this racial wealth gap. Okay, that's another class. But if you look at the period after 2008, this is where it really gets really, I don't want to say interesting. Some degrees I want to say sad. But if you look at this, what happened was, yeah, certainly everybody took a hit. Everybody took a hit. White, Black, Latino households all took a hit in 2008 during the recession, housing market collapse. So prior to the housing market collapse, we still had maybe Black household wealth at $10,400 per year being maybe about 10% of white household wealth. But when we get into about the year after the recession, notice that wealth went down to about $1,000 per household for Black people. All right. Now, white households certainly took a hit, but notice they kind of rebounded a bit to $122,000 per household in terms of wealth. So now we're at a period of time where Black people on average have 1/100th the wealth of an average white household. I mean, that's reality. That's real. And so this is why we study demography, to tease out these kind of numbers, because decisions have to be made about how much money do we distribute for scholarships for African American kids so they can go to college. Because given this wealth gap, they're not going, right? And taking out loans, working 2 and 3 jobs to get through school, it's not sustainable. Something has to be done about that, right? Let's look at another piece of demographics in terms of the human geography of the United States. Let's look at these generations. So you've heard about Generation X, baby boomers, millennials. Well, what does all that mean? Well, baby boomers are people who were born between 1944 and 1964. What made that period of time unique was that it was the post-World War II period. It was a time of great prosperity. Soldiers were coming home from war. People were establishing homes. The middle class was growing for this population. And in turn, they had lots of babies. Translate that into technical terms. During the 20-year period from 1944 to 1964, the fertility rate in the United States was approximately 4. So what that means is that the average woman during that period of time had 4 children. That number is much lower now. It's less than half of that, less than half of that now. That population, that baby boom slowed down for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with women's position in society. A lot more women started to get into the workforce. You can read here that once women start to get more educated and get more engaged in the workforce, they're less likely to have children or put off having children until they're older, which means you're going to have less children due to this biology, right? So we started to see, of course, birth control, the advent of birth control came about during the 1960s. And so women could choose when they decide to become mothers. They had that control uh, in their hands with the birth control pill. So we started to see the population go into decline with Generation X. Um, and so Generation X are people born roughly between 1965 and maybe 1980-ish. And like I said, so that's Generation X. They represent the time of the baby bust. Then along come the millennials. Notice there are about as many millennials, or as of this graph was made in 2014. So shift all these ages up about 7 years. So the millennials are about as populous as the baby boomers, and probably by now might have taken over and surpassed the number of baby boomers because, of course, as people get older, you can see that the numbers start to fall off as people pass away as they get later in age, whereas millennials, who are now between ages 22 and maybe 40 is around there. They're pretty much in the prime of their lives and are thriving and healthy. However, and then of course, Generation Z, if you're 22 years of age and younger, then that's Generation Z. You're not a millennial. That's a different generation. So why do we study these generations? Well, a lot of businesses, people who are involved in sales, study demographics, especially generational demographics, a lot. For one thing that you might find of interest is that the baby boomers still hold 70% of the wealth in this country. Okay. The rest of you all have what's left, that last 30%. So that's going to create a very unique dynamic in terms of marketing. Now, we're still probably the wealthiest, if not one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But our wealth is not equitably distributed. So, for example, if you are a car company, if you are a car sales, you sell cars, let's say, a lot of millennials can't afford cars. A lot of millennials don't even want cars. Now what? How do you get one of them to buy a car? That takes some very creative advertising, right? Also, a lot of millennials are not only aren't in a position to buy a home, they don't want to buy a house. They're still young. They want to move around. They're not having any kids. As a matter of fact, there's a great fear that we are in a demographic and population crisis in this country because of the fact that we're not producing children the way we used to. So there's less people to be in the workforce. There's less opportunity for creativity. There's less people to go into the military and defend the country because of this downturn in births that we're experiencing right now. It doesn't seem to be letting up right away. So there are all kinds of questions about, okay, what are we going to do about that? Where are we going to get people to join the military if there's less and less and less young people? What about those of you who are going into education, going into teaching? There's less and less kids, right? That profession might not be a guaranteed job anymore as there are less and less and less children entering classrooms. Even for those of us who teach at the university level, eventually that drop that we see at Generation Z is going to reach college campuses. We're going to be competing for a smaller and smaller pool of young people to go to college. And knowing that Tennessee State University and other universities, other public universities are largely tuition funded. In other words, we get about 70% of our revenue from tuition, not from the state. So we're very much dependent upon recruitment efforts to keep the doors open to some of these colleges and universities, and we're going to have a smaller and smaller pool of students. So these are the many ways that these data are used. So don't think of this as, well, we're just learning about this, we can answer some questions on a test. No, people, maybe even you in your professional life, are actually going to use these data, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in education, whether you're a business major, whether you're a physician, or whether you're going to do pharmaceuticals or what have you. Speaking of pharmaceuticals and generations, did you know that the death rate for the coronavirus for people 65 years of age and older is 80%? 80%. So we have to start looking at that in terms of distributing the vaccine. That's specifically why they're going to these older people first, because that is going to significantly reduce the death rate. So I just wanted to illustrate and just kind of punctuate, why are we even studying this? Is this just for a class? No, I mean, this goes a lot farther than just something that you need to know for this next test. These numbers, these data are used in all kinds of decision making. All kinds of decision making. Here's an article about millennials and real estate. So here's a whole article about how different generations are positioned in terms of their buying power. And so, our economy here in the United States is 70% based upon consumer spending. So that's why studying these numbers also is very important. How do we get these people to spend money? How do we get these people, no matter what generation that they are, how do we get them to participate in the economy? I mean, if they, those are questions. I mean, that's a scientific question that has to be answered by us, that is being answered and asked in a lot of sectors of the economy. Because in order to keep this thing going, we have to figure out how to draw these people into becoming economically active and viable. Otherwise, the system collapses, right? So that's why we study these this human geography, these demographics. I mean, it's not just busy work. This is information that's actually used. So there are a lot of interesting articles here. Here's the Newsweek article that goes in. It's a little old. It's from 2010, 2009, 2010, but it's really an interesting look at how we study demographics and where people live and so on and so forth. There's a lot of interesting numbers in here that you might want to look at, some trends that we might want to look at in terms of, here's marriage. Notice in 1960, the average person was very young, 23 and 20. 23-year-old for men, 20-year-old for women, 20 years old for women, 1960 for the first marriage. And now that's approaching 30. So very interesting data that we see here in this Newsweek article about the demographics of the United States. Our population is getting older, as I mentioned, less and less young people. So all these variables are important aspects of studying demographics, formulating policy, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think that I am going to stop here. And again, this week is time to focus upon the midterm exam. Focus upon the research quiz one. This is midterm week, but remember this quiz is due on the 12th of March. That's Friday. Please make sure that you get that done. Again, if you have any questions, ask me. There's information in the lecture recording here for Monday. So make sure you do that. Okay, I'm going to stop recording now. If you're watching this recording and have questions, please let me know.